Bonjour, good morning, or good afternoon. Thanks for being here. Merci d'être ici. We're going to have a chat today with Angella MacEwen, economist. And what we're going to chat about today is a choice. And I put this to Parliament today. We debated our motion, and our motion is about a choice that in difficult times, which we know we're in right now, what do you do? What choice do you make? We know that families are struggling. They're having a hard time with a lot of things, finding childcare, paying the bills. People have lost jobs. Small businesses are worried about shutting down forever. So there's people that have gone through really difficult times, have made some big sacrifices. But at the same time, we know there's some groups of Canadians that have done really well. The richest Canadians, the billionaires, have increased their wealth by $37 billion since March. We know there's been massive profits, not just normal profits, but record profits for some companies. And we know that the wealthiest Canadians, the top billionaires in Canada, have seen none of their wealth decrease during this pandemic. So while everyday folks have been struggling, those at the very top have actually been doing really well. And if we have to make a choice about who pays, who contributes more, who helps with the cost of this pandemic, and who helps us get through this difficult time, well, everyday people have already made the sacrifice. And what we're saying is that the people at the very top should pay their fair share. And the way we do that, we're proposed two things in our motion today. One is a wealth tax, which we talked about before. It's a 1% on fortunes of over 20 million, and a tax on excess profit, inspired by what we did in the past during the world wars, that companies that have made record profits, that their excess profit above and beyond normal, what they've made off the pandemic, that should be taxed at a much higher rate so they can contribute to the cost of this recovery. Those who've actually profited and done really well should be the ones that actually have to pay the price, and not the people that have struggled and have been hurt and that are worried. They should not be the ones. And we should use that revenue to pay for the recovery, but to pay for the programs we need. So to bring into the discussion, I wanted to hear from Angella. The choice that's on the table, Angella, and you know this really well, is that the typical response that Liberals and Conservatives will have when times are tough is they're going to cut programs to people. We've seen Liberal governments do that. We've seen Conservative governments do that. And we've seen this current Liberal government hint at it, suggest that we need to cut programs. And in fact, more than just suggested, they threatened to cut CERB a number of times throughout the summer, and we fought back. They threatened to cut the amount of support people get. They're already looking to cut help to people, but they're not willing to talk about revenue. What would the impact of those type of cuts be, Angella? And what do you think about that choice that we have? And how does that choice play out as an economist in your mind?
Thank you. So we are in a very unusual time where we have huge deficits and we've been spending quite a lot of money. And we can borrow a lot of money at very low rates. So the federal government isn't in a position right now where they should be thinking about cutting spending. They should be thinking about how they can help provinces and municipalities and businesses and people get through the crisis, because this is going to go on for quite some time. And as you said, there are those, the very wealthy, those in very specific industries that have done well during the crisis. And it's not through any good planning of their own. It just happened to be that people moved to grocery stores and started buying things at grocery stores, right? So those are the companies that have really profited during the pandemic at the expense of other businesses that have had to close. And so in terms of thinking about this in fairness, it makes sense that those who have profited through no fault of their own, just because of the way that the economic impact of the pandemic rolled out, should be contributing more, and that we should be using that revenue to help those who, again, through no fault of their own, have had to close and have suffered huge losses. We've seen restaurants are closing, hair salons, lots of really small businesses that are integral to our communities are really struggling right now. And lots of people are really struggling right now. So I think the pandemic piece of that, the pandemic profit tax, is really about people seeing the system as fair. And also about people feeling secure that there will be enough revenue to carry us through. Because even though I don't see any reason for us to be worried about the amount that we're borrowing from the Bank of Canada, people are worried, as you say, because in the past, how governments have responded to this is by cutting services. And if we've seen anything, there's been a bigger demand for services, and that is what will help us get through the crisis. So we need more childcare in order for people to get back to work, and in order for those childcare spaces to be safe and kids to stay healthy. We need more money in schools. So the federal government needs to be helping the provinces make sure that they have the staffing and the ventilation and everything that they need to open up and be safe. We need more funding in long-term care centers, and we should be making sure that our communities are safe. And so that needs public services. This is not the time to be cutting back on those really important jobs, because that's what's getting us through the crisis. And so people are really worried, they're really nervous. It would have a bad impact on individuals' affordability. If they can't get childcare, it has an impact on the number of jobs that could be out there. So we can create more jobs by increasing these public services and providing these services that we need. But also then people have money to be able to spend in their communities, and keep the businesses that are open afloat. So what we see with austerity is it actually prolongs the recession, and it prolongs the economic pain. So this is mostly about fairness, I think, but it's also about the economic impact and making sure that we continue to support people, that they have security, knowing that government is doing what it can to make sure that happens.
Okay, and I really appreciate that, Angela. I want to just, if you could touch on the impact, like what would be the impact? So these two choices, the typical choice that we've seen liberal and government and conservative governments make is to cut help to people. They've done that in the past to balance budgets, to reduce spending. In this scenario, maybe you could touch on what would the impact of that choice be?
So if we're talking about the impact of cutting back on the big income supports that people are getting, we know that the economic recovery in terms of the labor market is going to be prolonged. So the impact of cutting back, that means that people are potentially not able to pay rent. They're not able to buy food. We're seeing a growing demand for food banks. We're seeing increased food insecurity, and it tends to be already hard hit areas. So when you look at Toronto, for example, a map of Toronto where that's happening, it's lower income families that are already multi-generational households that were already struggling, have been hard hit, and to remove that security from them now, it could be quite devastating. People can lose their houses. People can expose themselves to the virus because they're desperate for work. And so, yeah, so that initial impact on individuals is huge, but then it spreads out to the rest of the community, because now people can't afford to go grocery shopping. People can't afford to take the bus. And so bus fares are down. They can't afford to meet their basic needs. And so they're not spending money in their communities. So then their communities suffer.
Right. And Angela, if you could touch on one of the things that we've been asked is with the pandemic, profiteering, the tax on excess profits, we put that forward as a belief, something I strongly believe in. In terms of some of the potential ways that would work, have you turned your mind to some of the ways it's worked? I've cited some of the examples in the past using a figure like the corporate tax rate and saying maybe double the corporate tax rate on the excess profits as one of the potential ways, but to keep it fluid, because the goal would be finding a way that actually gives us the best return, that actually gives us the best revenue increase. Have you thought a bit about what that would look like?
Yes, so we've done it in the past. We're talking in Canada, it's significantly, I mean, it's grocery store chains that are the big ones. So it is fairly concentrated right now in the pandemic who has been profiting, which makes it easier to figure out. But yes, probably the thing that would make the most sense is doubling the corporate tax rates for those companies that have been profitable. You could look at past years in order to compare and see who has excess profits, what's been kind of unusual. And the CCPA has done this work, and they've seen that, the top billionaires in Canada have become $37 billion richer since the pandemic started. And that figure is becoming outdated. It's growing as we're talking. So people are, and during the war, companies felt like they were doing their part to help pay for the recovery, to actually give that money back. What we've seen with grocery store chains is that they undid the pandemic pay that they had been offering workers. So they haven't been willing to share those profits. They haven't been willing to extend, better wages and working conditions to workers that have been really essential to us during the crisis, and low-wage workers. And so they've shown that we're going to have to actually require them to chip in. We're not all in it together. If they can get out of paying their share, they will.
That's a really good point. I wanted to touch on this idea as well. Why do you think it is the case, Angela, that the knee-jerk reaction, it's how I've called it, the knee-jerk reaction seems to always be from both Liberal and Conservative governments? This current government's already signaling this. The knee-jerk is times are tough, cut help to people. Why is it never the fact that people look at potential sources of revenue, even very viable and just fair sources of revenue are completely ignored? It's never something that people talk about, or Liberal and Conservatives never talk about. They always go to cutting help to people. Why is it that, if you've got a thought on this as an economist, but just in general, why is it they never go to, okay, let's look at revenue? And is there a way for us to look at revenue, particularly if there's a whole bunch of folks that have done really, really well in this time? Why is it not something that people think about more, or Conservatives and Liberals, governments, I should say, that have governed Canada so far? Why is it they don't think that way?
Right. So a political economist would say that it would have to do with power, right? So who is the governing parties? In Canada's case, it's been Liberals and Conservatives. Who are they connected to? Who is their real base of power? Who are they friends with, right? Like, whose perspectives do they share? But also who actually, funds elections that we know are very expensive. And so we know that this Liberal government in particular came in 2016, 5 years ago now, 4 years ago.
2015,
it's so long.
Yeah, definitely.
The pandemic's been 5 years.
Yes.
They came in actually promising a whole bunch of tax reforms that they very quickly moved back on. So they promised to change how they taxed stock option loopholes. They promised to change how they taxed different types of corporations that have long been identified as stuff that primarily the very wealthy benefit from. And so they seem to be more responsive when those class interests push back than they are when the broader working class pushes back and says this isn't fair. So that's what I would say, is that they're less connected from actual working class interests, and they pay attention to their own class. There's the class solidarity there, where it's Bill Morneau, who worked on Bay Street. Those are his friends. These are his expectations. It's his worldview. But that's how the economy works. And I would dispute that. I think the economy works better when it's more equal, when the working class can meet their interests, when they can buy food and housing and be secure, that security actually promotes prosperity.
That makes a lot of sense. I really appreciate, Angela, having the time to chat with you. That was awesome. Thanks for sharing your insight. I'm sure there's going to be some more questions. I felt like I was kind of giving you a bit of a grilling there, but I just really wanted to hear your thoughts. And again, we're looking forward to questions that folks might have. We are proposing, as a New Democratic Party and as leader, I'm proposing a different way forward that does not put the burden on working class people, on everyday families. We're saying that in this difficult time, those who've already sacrificed shouldn't have to sacrifice more. But there are folks that have done really well, that are super rich, and we can ask them to contribute more fairly. And that is a way to actually pay for the cost of this pandemic and some of the cost of the recovery, which we know is really important. So those are some of my thoughts and the conversation you heard with economist Angella MacEwen. And I'm going to pass it over to Melanie Richer, my Director of Communications, who will take us to the next step. Thank you.
So we'll now start the question period. Nous allons maintenant commencer la période des questions. As usual, one question, one follow-up. We'll start with 3 questions on the phone before turning it to the room. Comme d'habitude, une question et une question de suivi. Nous allons commencer avec 3 questions au téléphone avant d'en prendre dans la salle. Please identify yourself before asking your question. S'il vous plaît, identifiez-vous avant de poser votre question. Operator, could we have a first question on the phone?
Thank you. Merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. And the first question, la première question est de Émilie Bergeron de l'agence QMI. Please go ahead. La parole est à vous.
Bonjour, Monsieur Singh.
Bonjour.
Je voudrais savoir ce que vous pensez de l'idée du Bloc québécois d'amender le projet de loi C9 sur la prolongation de la subvention salariale pour empêcher les partis politiques comme le NPD de toucher la subvention salariale.
Comme j'ai toujours dit, moi, je pense que le but de la subvention salariale, c'est de garder les emplois. Donc, pour moi, c'est important que si on a l'option de garder un emploi au lieu de dire qu'on ne peut pas continuer d'embaucher quelqu'un et puis cette personne va essayer d'accéder à l'assurance emploi, c'est meilleur de garder l'emploi au lieu des autres options. Donc, je veux continuer d'appuyer la subvention salariale pour tout le monde parce que c'est important de garder les emplois. Et ça, c'est pourquoi on a dans le passé, encouragé ou forcé le gouvernement d'augmenter la subvention salariale qui était à 10% jusqu'à 75%. Donc, c'est quelque chose qu'on appuie et je vais continuer d'appuyer cette idée de garder les emplois.
OK, donc vous n'êtes pas d'accord, si je comprends bien, avec le Bloc québécois là-dessus. Et ma question de suivi, pensez-vous avoir les appuis nécessaires pour faire passer votre motion sur un impôt pour les ultra-riches?
On ne sait pas qu'est-ce que le gouvernement va faire ou les autres partis vont faire. Mais je présente cette option encore. Si on est dans un temps difficile, le choix, c'est quelqu'un doit payer la facture. Mais de notre côté, on pense que ça va être les ultra-riches qui payent le juste part. Ceux qui ont fait des profits records, ils doivent payer le juste part au lieu de faire ce que les libéraux et les conservateurs ont fait dans le passé, continuent de proposer. Ça, c'est de mettre toute la pression sur les épaules des monsieur, madame, tout le monde. Je suis contre cette idée. Je pense que les plus riches doivent payer le juste part.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. Once again, please press star 1 if you have a question. De nouveau, n'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile 1 pour toute question. There are no questions registered at this time. I'd like to turn the meeting back over to you.
Thank you. We'll now take 3 questions in the room. Nous allons maintenant prendre 3 questions dans la salle.
Good afternoon, Mr. Singh. It's Manu
Good afternoon.
with the Canadian Press.
Excellent.
I just want to ask you how you define excess.
Excess?
Profit. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of fluid because
Yes.
yesterday you mentioned like tech giants like Amazon, Facebook, the others, and now you guys are talking about grocery chains. Now, do you have any like specifics on how you define this?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And it's very important because it is something that's fluid. And so what we're proposing is there's many ways to do it. What we could do is we could look at what is a normal trend for this company over the past number of years. Even if there's an increased trend, they're increasing their profits by a certain margin every year. Looking at what that trend is and where they should be and comparing it where they are. We know that there's been in excess of what normally a company earns in this time period. There's companies that have made massive profits. So anything that's outside of what they would normally make or is on a trend of what a company would normally make should be then considered excess. We could also look at percentages in terms of what percentage would be within the normal course and what percentage is above and beyond that, and that could be attributed to COVID-19. So there's ways for us to set that. Is it, a certain figure over and above what the normal profit would be? we can also make sure that it's clear that it's not about small businesses that have done well in this time. We made the motion very clear about big corporations, large corporations. So we've got definitions around what a small business is already in our Canada Tax Code. So we can look at what large corporations have made massive profits in this time, and it's very obvious which companies have done really well. So we could look at a number of ways to do it. Our point is we have to do the work. Instead of putting the burden on people, we should ask those who've done really well in this time to pay their fair share. That's our assertion, and we're very open to finding the best way to do that.
Yes, Mr. Singh, I also want to ask you about the election in the United States. Now, as the counting continues, there are many reports from many states that more people of color, Black people, Hispanic voters have voted for Trump in 2020 compared to the numbers in 2016. What are your thoughts on this? What do you think? What do you make of this?
I was initially really troubled, thinking about all the things that President Trump has done, Donald Trump has done, and then looking at the vote. And I was hoping for just a clear rebuke of just a lot of horrible things. We've seen the treatment of just the language he uses, the misogyny, the xenophobia, and really concretely the response to COVID-19. Denying basic science and making it a questionable or a partisan thing to wear a mask or not. Not supporting the experts' advice around what would be the best response, rejecting those really basic things that resulted in a lot of people dying. And so initially I was a little upset to see that. It troubled me to see that. But then I thought, what is actually happening is that there are a lot of people that are really frustrated, and they're really lost, and they're really afraid, and they're really worried. And they've been let down. And because people who are feeling let down and frustrated and who've been kind of let down in such a massive way, it's easier for folks who are really angry and frustrated to be manipulated by someone in power to point the blame where it is not meant to be pointed. When we know that if in America, the same thing as in Canada, the wealthiest have gotten massively wealthier and everyday other folks have hurt, and President Trump put in place a tax cut that allowed the wealthiest to make even more money, clearly he's not working for the interests of people. But that just reminds me that we have to do even more to fight the cynicism, this fact that people are feeling let down. People need good jobs, they need a house they can afford, they need healthcare that's there for them. If we can help people out in a real way, we can tackle the cynicism. And it's really because people felt let down that they were able to be manipulated in a way by someone in power, like the president, who then stoked fears about the wrong problems and not really what's at stake, instead of focusing on what we can do to fix things and make things better for people.
Hi, it's Annie Bertrand-Oliver with CTV National News.
Hi there.
Hello. So right now, by many reports, it appears that Joe Biden is the closest to clinching the presidency. I've heard you talk about Donald Trump, as you just did, but I haven't heard you talk too much about Joe Biden. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on Joe Biden and what a win for him would mean for Canada.
Well, on one concrete thing in terms of COVID-19, that's the biggest thing on people's minds. People are worried. They see the massive numbers in the States, and we can't ignore the fact that we are so closely tied, that a massive epidemic or a pandemic that has a particular localized growth in the States is going to have an impact on Canada. And there's a lot of interplay in terms of our economies, travel. For a lot of reasons, we're worried about what goes on there. For one thing and only one thing, if nothing else, for one concrete thing, we know that Joe Biden has made it really clear he would follow the expert advice of scientists, that he does not dispute the important measures that we need to take, and that he would not make this an issue of his own personal whims. Whether or not we follow the advice of science or the advice of medical experts, he would take that advice seriously and put in place at least that level of confidence that they would follow what's required in order to keep people safe. And that, I think, alone is enough to give us some sigh of relief if he was president.
And assuming that is the case, his lead is growing in Nevada. The gap is narrowing between him and Donald Trump in Pennsylvania. I wonder what you think the federal government's top priority should be when engaging with the new administration, and how you think that our relationship with the U.S. would change.
Well, the top issue is going to be COVID and how we respond to it in a way that brings the numbers down, that alleviates a lot of the fear and the worry. That should be, of course, our top priority. And then when it comes to the Canada-U.S. relationships, I expect that we need to, as always, fight for Canadians and Canadian jobs and make sure that we are treated fairly and standing up where it's required to fight for that fairness. I think there seems to be a more rational and thoughtful approach that Joe Biden's team has taken to various issues. So I expect that would hopefully also include our relationship with Canada. And I look forward to us always fighting for Canadians and fighting for good jobs. And on a global level, fighting to make sure we tackle COVID-19 and the other issues that we're faced with, the climate crisis, a renewed approach to fighting the climate crisis like we want to win it. And I think these are some of the things that we can work together on.
Hi, Mr. Singh, David Thurton, CBC News.
Hey there.
Is the NDP still taking supports that the government has offered to businesses and organizations during the pandemic?
Yes. The wage
So my
subsidy.
Just the wage subsidy?
Yes.
Okay. Just my next question is,
Oh, we could double check with our party if there's other measures in addition, but I'm certain of the wage subsidy.
and so we have the Bloc Québécois leader today asking on parties to stop taking the subsidy, to repay it back. They're going to be proposing an amendment to Bill C-9. What's your response to the Bloc leader?
Well, from the beginning, I strongly supported a wage subsidy. In fact, we fought to increase it from 10%, which is what the Liberals initially put it to. And I cited at least 75% is what it should be. And we were able to get it to 75%. I believe it's much better for someone to have a job than to lose their job and then to struggle with either accessing employment insurance or some other way to keep on, to kind of get it, to keep on paying the bills and to keep on moving forward. So there's no question. I believe that the wage subsidy is important. As long as we qualify, we should use it to keep people employed. And if we don't qualify, then we won't use it.
Operator, is there one last question on the phone?
As a reminder, please press star 1 at this time for any question. À titre de rappel, n'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile 1 pour toute question. There are no further questions registered.
This concludes the press conference. Thank you. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.
Merci. Thank you.